Appendix B, Scientific Testing for Paternity Establishment. Introduction. The problem of disputed parentage and the search for ways to resolve it are not new. Japanese folklore of the 12th century describes methods for dealing with genealogical controversy. In those times, any person claiming to be an heir to an estate was required to undergo a blood test. The finger of the individual making the claim was pricked and a drop of blood was permitted to drip on the skeleton of the deceased. If the blood soaked in, the claim was upheld. In still another test, two persons who claimed to be related were required to allow drops of their blood to drop into a basin. Their relationship was recognized only if their respective drops of blood merged in the basin. Tests used to establish or disprove relationship have grown increasingly sophisticated over the years. In particular, tests of the paternal relationship have profited from the scientific advancements of the last 25 years. Today, the possibility of excluding a falsely accused man is greater than 90% and is sometimes as high as 99%. It is fortunate both for children and for the men who father them that these advances have been made in the science of genetic identification. Today, the paternity trial is more than a credibility contest. Evidence is available and widely used throughout the court system that minimizes the guesswork involved in determining the parentage of a child. If a man is falsely accused of fathering a child, genetic testing can prove his innocence 99% of the time, depending on the content of testing. Moreover, this conclusive and readily available evidence is relatively inexpensive, especially when the cost of blood tests, usually no more than $400 for a full battery of tests, which is not always necessary, is balanced against the cost of supporting a child for a period of 18 years. In addition, tests which indicate that a man may have fathered a particular child may be interpreted further to determine the likelihood that he did father the child in question. While statistical estimates of plausibility, or inclusionary evidence, are not accepted as widely throughout the court system as determination of exclusion are, these estimates are extremely reliable. In particular, when considered together with other evidence of relationship, genetic evidence of this kind can turn an essentially subjective determination into a far more objective and verifiable proceeding. This appendix discusses the genetic basis of paternity testing and reviews the tests most often used for paternity establishment, which include the red blood cell antigen, the human leukocyte antigen, and the red cell enzyme and serum protein tests, more commonly referred to as electrophoresis. A description of the technology used in the tests and the strength of the testing results also is provided. Other issues examined include various approaches for determining and expressing probability rates, the likelihood that a man is the father of the child, standards for blood testing laboratories as specified by the American Association of Blood Banks, AB, and current research on technology for paternity testing. The genetic basis of paternity testing. A basic understanding of the laws of heredity is needed to comprehend how genetic principles are applied to parentage testing. All human traits are determined by genes inherited from both parents, including both red and white cell blood types. At conception, the mother's egg, which contains 23 chromosomes, combines with the 23 chromosomes contained in the father's sperm. As a result, the child inherits 46 chromosomes which are paired in 23 sets. Within each set, one chromosome is inherited from the mother and one from the father. These chromosomes contain the genetic markers that determine all inherited characteristics. Since children inherit half of their genetic markers from their mother and half from their father, deductions can be made regarding which genetic markers are paternal in nature when the mother's and child's genetic markers are known. Because the components of human blood contain many of these inherited and identifiable genetic markers, it is possible to use blood tests to determine parentage. Of course, it is possible for a man who is not the biological father of a particular child to possess genetic markers that appear in the child. However, it is extremely unlikely that he will possess by sheer chance a large number of genetic markers that appear in the child. For this reason, paternity blood tests examine independent groups, or systems, of genetic markers in the blood of the child, mother, and alleged father. Knowing the variations in any one marker that are present in the blood of the mother and the child, one can specify the range of variations that may appear in the blood of the biological father. If the variations observed in the blood of the alleged father do not fall within this range, he may be excluded from paternity. When the blood of the alleged father contains the genetic markers that are required to be present in the blood of the biological father, he cannot be excluded from paternity. Moreover, because gene frequencies have been determined for diverse populations, specialists can predict with great accuracy the likelihood that a given man actually is the biological father of a child, and not just someone who happens to share the same blood characteristics with an unrelated individual. Other factors that make the identification of genetic markers very effective in paternity determination are as follows. They are expressed at birth or shortly thereafter. They remain stable through life and are unaffected by extrinsic factors such as age, illness, diet, etc. They can be identified relatively easily through scientific tests which allow both accurate and reproducible identification. The scientific techniques that have been developed can provide statistically reliable data necessary to establish a child's parentage. Consequently, the scientific testing has transformed the paternity establishment process from a credibility contest to a conclusive, fact-oriented proceeding. At the beginning of this century, Dr. Karl Landsteiner's discovery of the ABO blood group system provided the basis for paternity testing as we know it today. As additional blood group systems such as MNSS, RH, Cal, Duffy, and KID were discovered, the potential use of blood groups in paternity establishment increased. While these systems are commonly referred to as blood groups, the term technically refers to antigens present on red cell membrane to which the body reacts by producing antibodies. In testing blood group systems, red blood cells are exposed to a specific antibody under controlled conditions, and the cells then are examined for a reaction of the antigen to the known antibody. The absence or presence of the antigen is determined according to the absence, negative reaction, or the presence, positive reaction, of agglutination, clumping. A laboratory technician can determine whether a reaction has occurred by examining the antigen-antibody mixture in the test tube over a magnifying mirror. For example, when testing the ABO system, a reagent which contains the known antibodies that will react to A, B, AB, and O red blood cells are introduced to the antigen on the red blood cell. Group A red blood cells will react only to anti-O antibodies, Group B red blood cells will react only to anti-B antibodies, Group AB red blood cells will react to both anti-A and anti-B antibodies, and Group O red blood cells will react to neither. Similar test procedures are used with the other blood group systems. Since the reactions that should occur when specific antigens are present on the red blood cells are known in the medical field, a laboratory technician can determine the typing of the antigens. Unfortunately, red blood cell antigens are not distributed in the population with sufficient variation to allow medical experts to draw valid conclusions regarding the probability of an individual's paternity. Consequently, if the red blood cell antigen test does not provide exclusionary evidence, data that determines that the man is not the father of the child, the statistical probability of inclusion of parentage, likelihood that the man is the father of the child, is not admissible in evidence. As a result, the use of red blood cell antigen test results was limited to exclusionary evidence for many years. While the red blood cell antigen test is not self-standing for purposes of inclusionary evidence, both the medical and legal communities recommend that the test should be performed first when testing for paternity determination. If a man can be excluded in this way, no further tests are required. The red blood cell antigen test is relatively simple to perform and inexpensive in comparison to other testing procedures. Moreover, if exclusion cannot be established at this first stage, the test results can be incorporated with those of additional tests to obtain inclusionary evidence. Red cell enzyme and serum protein test. Tests which are gaining increasing respect as a reliable scientific measure for parentage determination are the red cell enzyme and serum protein tests. Serum is a complex solution containing a number of proteins. These proteins are composed of amino acids, each of which has a slight electrical charge. As with blood cell structures, the information for the production of these proteins is determined genetically. Placed in an electric field, proteins will migrate at a rate proportional to their electrical charge and size. The rate of migration can be controlled by varying the medium. The denser the medium, the slower the migration of large proteins. By selecting the appropriate current and medium, a wide range of proteins can be separated. Electrophoresis is the procedure used to separate protein molecules based on their size and electrical charge. In practice, a small amount of sample is placed on an electrophoresis plate along with known standards and the current applied for a prescribed length of time. The plate is then stained to reveal the location of the various proteins, and the migratory distance of the unknown is compared to a standard to identify the genetic type. The reasons for interest in this testing are many. The migration patterns which are measured and compared to known standards are easy to read. In addition, the slides can be dried, which allows a permanent record and physical evidence which can be presented in court by an expert witness. An additional advantage to using this type of testing is that rare variants can be identified through their migration rate, so there is no extra labor involved in locating them. Assume, for example, that a rare variant is found 1 in 1,000 times in a system, a not unreasonable assumption. If one is testing 10 systems, a rare variant in one of the systems will occur 1 in 100 times. If this variant is passed on to the child, parentage is relatively assured. As in other types of testing, new in systems that have fairly evenly distributed gene frequencies are being discovered. Some of the more common systems in use now are phosphoglucomutase, PGM, adenosine deaminase, ADA, esterase D, ESD, 6, phosphogluconate dehydrogenase, 6-PGD, and group-specific component, GC. As new systems are being added, the red cell and serum protein tests are becoming more powerful as probability rates for both exclusion and inclusion are increasing. Blood testing laboratories are finding that if a man is not the father of a child, the chance of his being excluded on the basis of this test runs anywhere from 80 to 85%. However, if the testing results are combined with those of the red blood cell antigen test, the exclusionary rate is between 89 and 96%, because the cost of performing enzyme and serum protein testing can be half that of HLA testing, and because the test results are becoming more accurate as new systems are discovered. Serum protein testing is becoming more popular with the medical and legal communities. Since the technical procedure used for this testing is quite different than that used for the red blood cell antigen test and the HLA test, which will be discussed later, technicians require specialized training to perform this test. Furthermore, laboratories must have specific equipment. Consequently, many laboratories in this country still do not have the facilities or resources to perform electrophoretic testing. However, more laboratories have or are in the process of obtaining this technical expertise in order to provide it as part of their battery of tests. Human leukocyte antigen test. In principle, HLA testing is similar to red blood cell antigen identification, since it involves a reaction of all surface antigens to a specific antibody. However, the antigens tested are those found in the white blood cells, leukocytes, as well as all nucleated cells, rather than antigens found on the red blood cell. HLA structures are of primary importance in matching donors to recipients for organ transplantation. For this reason, they also are known as tissue antigens, transplantation antigens, or histocompatibility antigens. Like an individual's red blood cell antigen types, the white blood cell antigen types are genetically controlled. 4 subclasses of antigens are used to define an individual's tissue type. The genes coding for each white blood cell antigen type used in HLA testing are found at 3 closely linked locations, or loci, on the 6th pair of chromosomes. They are termed HLA A, HLA B, and HLA C. At conception, an individual inherits one complete set of genes, A, B, C, known as a haplotype, from each parent. By testing the white blood cells for the presence of antigen markers determined by gene codes at the HLA, A, B, and C loci, technologies can determine the phenotype of the individual tested. From the phenotype, the genotype, the haplotype derived from the individual parents, can be inferred. In HLA testing, the white blood cells are exposed to known antibodies and reactions of the antigen. Antibody mixture are observed to determine the identity of the antigens. While agglutination is the reaction observed in red blood cell antigen test, cytotoxicity or cell death is the reaction observed in the HLA test. More specifically, Human leukocyte antigens are tested by separating the white cells from whole blood to determine the specific ability of an antibody to kill the white cell. This testing is performed by separating the white cells from the other cells and mixing them together with known antibodies and complement, which is important for the reaction. After appropriate incubation, reactions are detected microscopically using a dye as an indicator. If there is dye inside the white cells, they have been killed, since cell walls become permeable on death, and foreign substances, such as dye, can enter the cell. If the cells remain alive, they are intact, and the dye cannot penetrate the cell. Approximately 180 antibodies exist, including at least 2 antibodies for each antigen tested. Therefore, 180 separate tests per person must be completed to reach a conclusion as to the actual tissue type of an individual. There are several drawbacks to HLA testing. As mentioned earlier, for complete typing for HLA, serological and genetic analyses of the antigens require at least 180 antibodies, which makes the procedure labor-intensive. In addition, the reagents necessary for the test are rare, so the entire process is quite expensive. Furthermore, the blood must be analyzed within 24 to 72 hours after it is drawn, because the cells will die if they are not separated rapidly from the blood. Consequently, most HLA typing is confined to a relatively few large facilities. The major advantage of HLA testing is that it is very polymorphic, that is, genetically rich. The large number of markers in each of the 3 gene groups, alleles, A, B, C, is so great that a large number of variations occur in the population. Moreover, any one variation has a very low frequency of occurrence. Consequently, HLA is a valuable test not only for exclusionary purposes, but for inclusionary purposes as well. If the red blood cell antigen tests fail to exclude the alleged father, and if his leukocyte variations match those of the child, it can be shown that he is a member of a class of, say, 2% of the population that could have fathered the child, or stated another way, that there is a 98% chance that he fathered the child. If other factors, such as access to the mother, are taken into account, the question of paternity can be resolved under law. Using the HLA test alone, it is possible to exclude over 90% of falsely accused men and to indicate those men who are highly likely to be the biological father. Combined with the red blood cell antigen test results, the percentage can be as high as 99%. New technology for paternity testing. The 3 types of testing most often used in paternity establishment: red blood cell antigen testing, HLA, and the enzyme and protein test, all involve analysis of genetic markers that represent inherited genetic characteristics rather than looking directly at a person's genetic makeup. One system being studied for paternity testing that is linked more closely to direct genetic composition is the chromosome banding test. In this procedure, approximately 10 white blood cells are selected for study and cultured in flasks. Different staining techniques reveal the chromosome bands. Differences in banding patterns are usually present in 4 to 6 of the 46 chromosomes in each cell. These patterns are heritable. The chances of excluding a man who is wrongly accused as the father of a child with the chromosome banding method probably approach 100%. Another testing procedure currently in the research stage is deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, probes. This new technique looks directly at a person's genetic composition, DNA. In simplified form, the process works as follows. The DNA is extracted from white blood cells and divided into pieces by means of a specific enzyme, a chemical scissors that cuts the DNA only at specific sites. The number of these sites present in an individual's DNA dictates the number and size of DNA fragments generated by the enzyme. When this process is repeated with several enzymes, each of which cuts at different sites, enough information is gathered to construct a detailed genetic fingerprint of a person. Paternity is then determined by comparing the accused man's genetic fingerprint with that of the child. The advantages of these new methods is that no 2 people have the same genetic makeup, except identical twins. Thus, it is hoped that as the procedures are perfected, they will be more accurate than any currently available. Presently, however, neither the chromosome banding nor the DNA probe method have passed the test of legal acceptance. Furthermore, both methods are expensive and not readily available. However, As research continues, and as other genetic factors are being tested for their appropriateness in paternity testing, it seems possible that both exclusionary and inclusionary rates will increase dramatically in the future. Guidelines for paternity blood testing. In 1976, a joint committee of the American Medical Association, AMA, and the American Bar Association, ABA, recommended guidelines for paternity blood testing. These guidelines are directed toward obtaining meaningful exclusionary or inclusionary evidence, and take into account the relative advantages and disadvantages as well as the resolution power of each technique discussed. Based on their findings, the committee concluded the following: it is not the intent to recommend in all medico-legal problems of disputed parentage that the entire set of tests is mandatory. It is often possible to establish exclusion with the basic blood group systems, ABO, RH, and MNSs. When these basic tests do not allow exclusion, extended testing may be done, using Kell, Duffy, and Kidd systems, to increase the mean probability of exclusion to the 63 to 72% level. If no exclusion is found, testing by human leukocyte antigens or electrophoresis should proceed until at least 90%, but preferably 95 to 99%, of all wrongly accused men are excluded. Exhibit A, which outlines the available methods of paternity testing discussed earlier, supports the AMA/ABA guidelines. To increase efficiency, paternity tests are taken sequentially, using first an approach that yields a 90% or better chance of exclusion. The combination of red cell antigens with enzymes and proteins has substantially the same efficiency of exclusion as the combination of red cell antigens with HLA. Each provides a likelihood of exclusion of greater than 90%. As the table indicates, use of all systems yields a probability of exclusion of 99%. However, it is neither practical nor efficient to utilize all three groups routinely for the following reasons: the different groups of tests utilize different skills and techniques. At present, very few laboratories offer all the systems. The cost of testing all systems and the inconvenience of submitting specimens to several laboratories is considerable. Regardless of whether one starts with red cell antigens plus enzymes and proteins, or white cell antigens, HLA, exclusion of a falsely accused man will be made 90% of the time. If the tests used indicate a sufficiently high probability of paternity, no further testing may be required. If the results are inconclusive, further analyses may be desirable. Use of all tests will result in an overall exclusion of 99% as indicated by the table. Interpretation of paternity test results. As recommended by the AMA/ABA, laboratories should be able to exclude at least 90% of falsely accused men based on test results. In general, laboratories that specialize in paternity testing advertise the strength of their tests according to probability of exclusion, PE, that is, the probability that a given test or combination of tests will exonerate a falsely accused man. The probability of exclusion should not be confused with probability of paternity, which is a statement expressing the likelihood of paternity in a particular case. They are independent concepts and are mathematically unrelated. Every genetic system has an associated PE. For the ABO system, the PE is roughly 0.17, for MNs, it is 0.32, etc. For HLA, it ranges from 0.88 to 0.92, depending upon the number of different test antibodies used. The HLA test is the best single system in terms of having the largest PE, but is not the best test. The best test would be one which would give a total PE of better than 99%. In fact, any combination of systems which can give a total PE of 0.88 to 0.92 would equal the HLA test in the ability to detect falsely accused men. Thus, two separate laboratories may use the same techniques in testing but have different PS depending on the level of testing. Consequently, when selecting laboratories and methods of testing, paternity workers, you may need the book in order to follow along. Reprinted from Blood Testing, Oaks Tempo 4, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, April 15, 1980. This summary is taken in large part from a pamphlet prepared by Paternity Testing Laboratory, Department of Pathology, Memorial Hospital Medical Center of Long Beach, California, and reprinted with the permission of Jeffrey Morris, M.D., PhD. No official support or endorsement of the laboratory or any one blood testing group, system, or technique by the Office of Child Support Enforcement, DHHS, is intended. Should base their selection on the PE that the laboratory offers, rather than the method of testing implemented. Exclusionary methods. While absolute proof of paternity cannot be established by scientific testing, exclusion of paternity is considered absolute if results are based on direct exclusion, Class I, or on indirect exclusions, Class II. Direct exclusion refers to testing results which demonstrate that the child possesses a genetic marker lacking in both parents. For example, in using the ABO system, a direct exclusion is obtained when the child types as B, and both the biological mother and alleged father type as O. Since neither the mother nor the alleged father can contribute the B gene, and there are almost no exceptions to this rule, this information constitutes a direct exclusion and is considered adequate evidence for non-parentage. Indirect exclusions are obtained if the child does not possess a genetic marker that he or she should have received if either parent was homozygous, the two genes in a pair being identical, for this marker. For example, in using the MNS's system, the mother may type as an MN, the alleged father as an M, and the child types as an N. The child would appear homozygous for the N gene, which the father appears to lack. In addition, the alleged father appears homozygous for the M gene which the child lacks. However, the alleged father may possess the rare gene MG which the laboratory could detect only by using a specific reagent that would demonstrate the rare factor and distinguish between the homozygous state, exclusion, and the presence of the rare factor in the child and the alleged father, non-exclusion. Too often, these reagents are not available, and laboratories resort to testing other systems that may reveal direct exclusion. Thus, the distinction between direct and indirect exclusion is that in direct exclusion, the child carries a genetic marker which is not demonstrated in either the biological mother or the alleged father, while indirect exclusion is based on an assumption that either of the parents is homozygous. While people may appear homozygous, genetic abnormalities may produce inaccurate results. Gene mutations, recombination of unexpressed genes that leave unexpressed antigens, are examples of rare factors that would require additional testing with the specific reagents that are often not readily available. Consequently, many laboratories find it necessary to find exclusion in at least two different genetic systems before excluding parentage with confidence. Multiple system exclusions are always desirable and are necessary for an unqualified statement of exclusion when indirect exclusions are involved. Inclusionary methods. When a man is not excluded from parentage, statistical calculations can reveal the probability of paternity, sometimes referred to as the likelihood or plausibility of paternity. How the calculations are made is perhaps the most controversial issue in the paternity testing field because there are several methods of calculations used. Each method is based on a different premise, though each premise is itself mathematically sound. Prior probability. The most often used calculations in paternity testing are based on Bayes' theorem, a mathematical statement about the effect new information has on previously held beliefs about chances. This method relates the probability of an item, alleged father, with certain attributes, genetic markers, being a member of a particular group, biological father, to the probability that a known member of the group would have the same attributes. The most often used calculations use a neutral prior probability, that is, that a random man and the alleged father had an equal opportunity to father the child. The rationale for using a neutral prior probability rate is that an impartial laboratory should not assess the value of non-genetic information. Since the laboratory has no knowledge of the evidence, most laboratories assign a neutral estimate of 0.5 from a scale of 0-1, ranging from impossible to certain, which is indicative of a particular event having occurred. The Essen-Moller calculation, the one recommended by the AMA, and the Hummel modification, which expresses the likelihood of paternity in a percentage, both imply a neutral prior probability. This impartial calculation has implications for the paternity worker. Blood testing laboratories are not privy to all the information on a particular case and cannot weigh the laboratory results relative to other factors. The person who can evaluate the case is the worker or attorney who has been working directly with the mother and the alleged father. Consequently, The paternity worker must be able to recognize special situations in which this parameter of prior probability has a greater or lesser meaning. The Neyman-Pearson theory argues that weighed prior probability is appropriate. The following example supports weighed prior probability. A bite is inflicted in a blackout in Times Square. Given the nature of the two animals, a tiger is more likely to bite one than a dog. But tigers are much scarcer in Times Square, while the probability that a dog would bite one is less than 1%, and would lead to rejecting the null hypothesis that the miscreant was a dog. It does not lead the rational mind to decide that, after all, it probably was a tiger. As shown, there are pros and cons in using both weighed and neutral prior probability. Perhaps a statement by Hummel best explains why a neutral prior probability rate is recommended by AMA/ABA. Equality before the law requires that if a man denies a child's allegation that he is the child's father, these two claims must be treated as equal. The probability of his being the father is the same as that of not being a father. Accordingly, in cases involving one man, the prior probability of paternity should be 0.5. The legal philosophy behind this prior probability cannot be challenged so long as the legal rights asserted by the child are valued as highly as those defended by the man. Calculation of probability of paternity. As mentioned previously, there are numerous methods that can be used in calculating inclusionary evidence. The following is an explanation of the method recommended by the AMA/ABA and which assigns neutral prior probability. The paternity index is a calculation which estimates the possibility that the tested man might be the father of the child. The paternity index indicates how many men of the same background as the alleged father would have to be tested to find another man who could be the father of the child. Several factors are taken into account when determining this number. First, each of the genetic systems that can be passed on by the alleged father to the child are tested. In other words, what needs to be determined is whether the alleged father's sperm have all the necessary characteristics to pass on to the child in question. If so, the calculation needs to consider whether all his sperm or only some have the necessary characteristics. The answer to this question will depend on whether the man is homozygous or heterozygous. The gene frequency is based on how many men of similar ethnic background as the alleged father would have to be tested to find another man who could be the father of the child in a random population. Gene frequency tables are based on laboratory tests of several thousand individuals that have been selected at random, and are calculated for racial populations. Typically, these tests are done in paternity cases, from blood donors, etc., and are compared with other laboratories. To illustrate how this calculation is computed, first assume that if the alleged father is homozygous, his genotype is AA. This means that all his sperm have the necessary characteristics to pass on the A gene 100% of the time. If he is heterozygous, his genotype being O, his sperm have the appropriate characteristics to pass on the A gene 50% of the time. The next step in determining the paternity index is to calculate how frequently another man at random also will be able to contribute the A gene that the child has. That is, if such a person were to have had a sexual relationship with the mother, how often would this occur? For example, assume that the frequency of the A gene occurs in a random population 25% of the time. Therefore, the other characteristic, 0, occurs with a frequency of 75%. If an A gene has a 25% change of occurring, and A is the characteristic we are testing for, we would determine the ratio of X, the chance of the sperm having A, over Y, the frequency that A occurs in the random population. When the man is homozygous, X equals 1, and if A has a frequency of 25%, 1 divided by 25% or X over Y equals 4. If, on the other hand, the man is heterozygous, then X equals 0.5, and X divided by Y would be equal to 2. This calculation is done for each specific system since the true biological father of the child must contribute all the paternal genes, and, of course, the alleged father is able to pass each such gene to his offspring. In order to determine the paternity index, the resulting numbers from each system tested, each X, Y, are then multiplied together. The paternity index reflects the number of random men who would have to be tested in order to find another man who could have fathered the child in combination with the mother. The paternity index number is used to determine likelihood value of paternity. The likelihood value of paternity is calculated by dividing the paternity index number and the paternity index number plus 1 and multiplying by 100 to get a percent. For example, P1/P1 plus 1 by 100. The calculation gives a percent basis of how many more times it is likely that the man who has been tested could be the father versus some man picked at random who has not been tested. This method of calculating probability of paternity is employed by the majority of parentage testing laboratories in the United States and Europe, and it is the method most familiar to the American court system. However, there has been some criticism. For example, Dr. Michael Akin argues that their probability figure is not, in fact, the probability that the alleged father is the true father. In addition, he maintains that assumptions, sometimes self-contradictory, affect the denominator of the likelihood ratio used in the calculation, and that speculation about genotypes that does not constitute scientific evidence are used in post-inclusionary calculation. Dr. Akin's arguments against paternity probabilities originally appeared in an article entitled Some Fallacies in the Computation of Paternity Probabilities, published in the American Journal of Human Genetics. 6. Appendix C includes a summary of his argument and a rebuttal to the original article by Dr. Richard H. Walker. Selecting a blood testing laboratory. When selecting a blood testing laboratory, the foremost consideration is whether the laboratory performs a sufficiently detailed series of tests to exclude most wrongfully accused men. The AMA/ABA guidelines recommend a rate of 90 to 95%. Furthermore, in cases where an exclusion is not achieved, the persuasiveness of the inclusionary evidence is tied directly to the probability of exclusion that has been rendered by the battery of tests. In addition, one should not rely solely on a lab's advertisement that it performs both HLA and enzyme, protein tests. The probability of exclusion is tied to the number of factors and variations tested within each category of testing. Different labs test different numbers and combinations of factors. There are other considerations as well, and these are discussed below. Ability to handle required volume. The 4D agency should determine in advance whether the lab can support the anticipated volume of work. Procedures and protocol at blood testing labs can be matters of significance during paternity trials, and the agency must make sure that the lab understands its needs in this area. Provide service at a reasonable cost. Generally, labs that perform red blood cell enzyme and serum protein tests are less expensive than labs that perform HLA tests. The relatively flexible handling requirements for the enzyme and serum samples permit one to use labs anywhere in the country. Provide expert testimony in selected cases. Expert testimony can be required during disputed paternity trials. In most states, extremely few paternity cases go to trial. Blood test reports can be particularly useful in encouraging a negotiated settlement. In the estimated 5 or 6% of disputed cases which finally must be tried, it is highly advantageous to have medical evidence available showing the likelihood of paternity based upon genetic resemblance of the accused father and the child. Provide effective quality control procedures. The lab's method of certifying and reporting test results also should be agreed upon in advance. Such practices as duplicate testing for key factors by different technicians should be encouraged and discussed if they are performed. Test reports that list all tests performed and provide detailed discussions of any factor that may result in an exclusion should be required. If no exclusion is achieved, test reports should include calculations of the probability that a wrongly accused man would have been excluded, and possibly a calculation of the probability of paternity based on the test results. Expert testimony, either in person or by deposition, also should be available. Provide adequate chain of custody. Chain of custody refers to the possession and control of the blood samples from the time they are drawn until the time the blood is analyzed. Selecting a lab requires careful inquiry concerning methods used to identify the parties and procedures used to label and seal blood specimens. Adequate precautions should be taken at every stage of the proceeding to lessen the risk of basing results on the wrong samples. Procedures for blood testing laboratories. The clinical laboratory plays an important role in cases of disputed parentage. Because of the legal aspects of scientific testing, precautions must be taken to ensure that the test results will be admissible as evidence in court. Consequently, such tests must be conducted with accepted techniques by qualified personnel and in such a way as to ensure the correct identification of the parties involved. Also, the chain of custody must be documented properly. The procedures followed by some laboratories are outlined below. Step 1. Referring. Most laboratories will not perform any testing unless a case is referred by a lawyer, physician, judge, or an appropriate welfare agency. Step 2. Scheduling. There are two alternatives to scheduling the parties to a paternity case for drawing the blood to be tested. The first alternative, if convenient, is to have everyone appear at the same time, to identify each, and to witness the drawing, labeling, and sealing of the blood specimens. The second alternative is to have the alleged father arrive before the mother and child to avoid any unpleasant scenes. If the second alternative is selected, the alleged father typically should be photographed before any blood is drawn and asked to sign his photograph before a witness. Some laboratories also take thumbprints. When the mother and child come to have their blood drawn, the mother should be asked to identify the alleged father and initial his photograph. Step 3. Verifying the donor's identity. Regardless of which alternative is selected for scheduling blood tests, samples can be obtained, confirmed, and labeled so there is not doubt later whether the samples were drawn from the right individual. At least two pieces of identification, such as a driver's license, social security card, or birth certificate, should be required from all parties. Prior to obtaining the blood samples, laboratory staff should counsel all parties to explain the procedure and the implication of the results. Appropriate consent forms should be completed, and a photograph and thumbprint of each party should be obtained for the purposes of identification and later court use if necessary. Step 4. Drawing the blood specimen. Blood must be drawn in sufficient quantity for the particular tests to be performed. Most blood typing procedures require only minuscule amounts of blood. Because it is difficult to obtain any significant volume of blood from a newborn infant, the child's veins are too small to locate. Many laboratories require that a child be at least 6 months old and in good health before they will attempt to obtain a blood sample. In addition, a child under 6 months may possess maternal genetic markers which were transmitted across the placenta while the child was in the uterus. A similar situation occurs when a person receives a blood transfusion. A laboratory should ask a donor if he or she has had a transfusion and how long ago the transfusion occurred. A blood specimen should not be taken unless 3 months have elapsed since the transfusion. If the laboratory performing the test was not responsible for drawing the blood, it is extremely important that the samples are labeled and sealed immediately after venipuncture and withdrawal. For the convenience of the parties, it is not at all uncommon for the blood to be drawn at a local hospital or physician's office and then shipped to the testing center. The major problem this imposes is that the blood must arrive in a condition suitable for analysis and chain of custody must be documented carefully. For HLA testing, this usually means delivery within 24 hours. The red blood cell components are hardier and can be tested several days after the blood is drawn. If non-HLA testing is performed, the blood may be delivered to the laboratory by ordinary mail. In fact, many laboratories provide insulated mailing containers for this purpose. It is recommended, however, that blood always should be drawn and shipped early in the week to avoid any unnecessary delay caused by storage over the weekend. Also, there must be no possibility of tampering with the specimens or confusion with others stored in the same area. These precautions should be standard operating procedures in a laboratory experienced in the handling of blood for paternity testing. Step 5. Documenting the chain of custody. The chain of custody is initiated by the person obtaining the specimen and should be maintained by each succeeding person who handles it. Specimens are marked for identification by each person who handles them. Each exchange of a specimen from one person to another should be documented by both according to a specified protocol. A single chain of custody form accompanying the specimen should be used to record all of the above described transactions. Many laboratories have prepared written procedures and design forms to document the chain of custody, and each link in the chain of custody may be documented and proven by affidavit. These safeguards lessen the chance that the chain of custody will be challenged in court. Until recently, child support enforcement programs had no guidelines or set standards to follow in the selection of a blood testing laboratory. However, in May of 1984, the American Association of Blood Banks, AB, released their standards for parentage testing laboratories. These standards apply to areas of personnel, policies, collection and identification of specimens, red blood cell antigen testing, HLA testing, red cell enzyme and serum protein testing, and reports and calculations. The Personnel and Policies section addresses the qualifications of the director and technical staff of the laboratory. It also covers various other aspects of the laboratory such as size, competency of staff, safety codes, storing and handling of reagents and blood specimens, testing methods, proficiency testing programs, use of reference laboratories, consulting with outside sources, and the development of a manual detailing all procedures and policies utilized by the laboratory. The Collection, Identification, and Documentation section specifies documentation vital to the legal and general laboratory aspects of the case, and requires the confidential maintenance of all case records. The standards for blood tests require the red blood cell antigen testing to be performed in duplicate, by different technicians utilizing at least 2 reagents from different sources for each antigen tested. Each HLA test must be plated on 2 separate trays or tray sets, each containing a minimum of 1 monospecific or 2 multispecific sera-defining HLA, A and B antigens. These trays must be read independently. The tests for the red cell enzymes and serum proteins also must be read independently by 2 different technicians. The Reporting and Calculations section requires that the information provided to the requesting agency be sufficient to permit an understanding of the results with a minimum of difficulty. In May 1982, the Office of Child Support Enforcement sponsored a forum to resolve of genetic test calculation issues. More than 40 experts from 7 foreign countries and the United States convened at the International Conference on Inclusion Probabilities in Parentage Testing. The conference was organized by the Committee for Parentage Testing of the American Association of Blood Banks. Attendees were selected for their knowledge and expertise in areas related to the calculation of parentage testing and included geneticists, statisticians, and lawyers. As a result of the conference, uniform guidelines were established for reporting estimates of probability of paternity. These guidelines are included in Exhibit B. In addition, AB standards were developed to assure any party involved in a paternity dispute that high-quality laboratory standards were established and used. Any laboratory involved in paternity testing is eligible to request accreditation by the AB. Once accredited, laboratories are reviewed annually. As a result of these new standards, much laboratory accreditation work is now being performed by AB.